So I'd like to thank you all for coming from wherever you are and in different time zones as well, and in your evening. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity. But before I begin, I did want to say, since I'm speaking about a Russian writer today, I want to say how forcefully I condemn Vladimir Putin and Russia's invasion of and war in Ukraine under Putin's regime. And I want to express my sympathy for those who have suffered because of it, or who live in fear. And in being Swedish as well, I feel that fear and shadow, as well as express my wholehearted support for those who oppose him, wherever they may be. And here I would also include my friends and colleagues in Russia, from Russia, and those who have been compelled to flee Russia. I will now share my slides, if you bear with me for a moment. So today I will speak about Leo Tolstoy as teacher, children's writer, and childhood studies pioneer, as Mateusz said in his kind introduction. I'd like to begin with an epigraph, as you see here. In 1862, the famous Russian writer Leo Tolstoy entitled a polemical article on pedagogy, "Who should learn to write from whom? The peasant children from us, or we from the peasant children?" 3 years earlier, being already an established writer in Russia, he had abandoned literature completely to open a school for peasant children on his estate at Yasnaya Polyana near Moscow, and devoted himself fully to an early foray into children's education. This experience also led him to write pedagogical and literary materials for children that, like the article in my epigraph, entangle pedagogical and aesthetic considerations and assert that adults should learn from children rather than children from adults. In this talk today, I will argue that Tolstoy was a significant childhood studies pioneer in numerous respects, not only as a pedagogue and children's writer, but also in his remarkably early acknowledgement of and promotion of children's creative capacities, as shown by his desire to engage in and publicize literary co-creation with children, which he also demonstrates in this article. Seen as a whole and in national and global contexts, Tolstoy's activities also represent a structured intervention that aims to reconfigure societal assumptions around childhood and for the sake of children, even if his efforts may fall short in some ways from a contemporary perspective, and he may have flaws as an individual as well. Nevertheless, Tolstoy's attempts to co-create literature with children, to assert its value more broadly, and reflect on its mechanisms, demonstrate a revolutionarily new approach to childhood and children's literature and culture at a remarkably early date. It also had the consequence of archiving or preserving for posterity the perspectives, voices, and creative impulses of these otherwise overlooked children of a bygone age. In this paper today, I will examine a variety of Tolstoy's pedagogical and aesthetic activities with and for children, to critically scrutinize his interventions related to childhood, showing both how they were innovative and how they founder. And I also will seek to position them in a national, global, and historical context. In so doing, I aim to lift forward Tolstoy not only as a children's writer and pedagogue, but also as a significant pioneer in childhood studies. His attempts to account for children's voices and literary capacity, even as he makes considerable sacrifices and devotes significant time and energy to promote the education of children, and underprivileged children in specific, prove influential in Russia and also in many ways ahead of his time in an international context. At the same time, Tolstoy's example truly epitomizes pedagogical and aesthetic entanglements around childhood, in a reference here to the theme of the 2021 Congress and the work of Justina Desh-Trubachak and Macarena Garcia Gonzalez, as well as significant interventions into children's education, children's literature, and childhood studies. When Tolstoy entitled his article, "Who should learn to write from whom, the peasant children from us, or we from the peasant children?" his own answer was never in doubt. He believed that his adult audience should learn to write from children. This formulation also echoes the motto of the journal Yasnaya Polyana he published, namely the quote from Goethe's Faust, "You think you're leading, but it's you who's being led." Tolstoy did not mince words in his resounding conclusion to his polemical article, as you see here. He writes, "It's impossible and absurd to teach and educate a child for the simple reason that the child stands closer than I do, and than any grown-up does, to that ideal of harmony, truth, beauty, and goodness, to which I, in my pride, wish to raise him. The consciousness of this ideal lies more powerfully in him than in me. All he needs of me is the necessary material to fulfill himself harmoniously and multifariously. The moment I give Fietka complete freedom and stop teaching him, he wrote a poetic work, one that is unique in Russian literature. And thus it is my conviction that we cannot teach children in general, and peasant children in particular, to write and to compose, particularly artistic works. All that we need teach them is how to set about writing." Although Tolstoy is situated in the past, as he writes from the perspective of a Platonic thinker, an admirer of Rousseau, and a writer influenced by romantic notions of childhood, his questioning of and reversal of the hierarchical roles of child and adult also anticipate developments in the view of childhood to come over the next century and a half. On the one hand, in a national context, this question of who should learn from whom also reflects Russia's 19th century return to the people and concomitant rediscovery of folk culture and art, even as calls to reform culminated in the 1861 abolition of the oppressive practice of serfdom in Russia. It also augurs a primitivist reevaluation of art in Russia and elsewhere that moves toward a reevaluation of the child as an artistic subject, including in modernist and avant-garde experiments of the early 20th century, as I discuss in my first book, Voiceless Vanguard, which was recently translated into Russian as Безречие авангарда. Today, however, I wish to argue that Tolstoy's question of who should learn from whom also resonates with or anticipates theoretical debates and shifts in perspective in childhood studies and children's literature research in more recent times. First, 4 decades ago, in the case of Peter Pan or the impossibility of children's literature, Jacqueline Rose framed an ongoing debate around the impossibility of children's literature in the sense that adults write for children across an impassable hierarchical divide, while an imbalance of power governs the relations of adult and child. In recent decades, within the context of attention in childhood studies to children's own agency, Robin Bernstein in Racial Innocence and elsewhere highlights how children, and even deeply disadvantaged children, have been part of the process of constructing and co-creating the performance of childhood all along. Still more recently, scholars have added further nuance to this picture, like Justina Desch-Trubacek, who discusses intergenerational solidarity, and together with Macarena Garcia Gonzalez in their introduction to children's cultures after childhood, foregrounds new methodological openings in textual and empirical works with texts and media co-created for, by, with young audiences. They also beautifully summarize past interventions on these topics as follows. As a field, we have come a long way from Jacqueline Rose's diagnosis of children's literature as a form of adult control over childhood and children, or Perry Nodelman's conception of it being a means of colonizing childhood by adults, through the preoccupation with the child and childhood as construct, heteronormativity, and the idea of the mighty child, threatening adults' power over the future. The focus on the child-adult binary is reflected in notions decentering adulthood as the norm and emphasizing children's agency as readers, critics, and creators of texts, such as the childist approach. The interest in another children's literature, the kinship approach to children's creative agency, and more recently, participatory and child-led approaches to children's literature studies. In light of these key moments in childhood studies and children's literature theorizing, as beautifully outlined here, one might say that Tolstoy engages in these same debates around impossibility, agency, and co-creation much earlier and at a remarkably early date, while also asserting a childist argument about children's own creative agency. One therefore might re-examine Tolstoy's statements about who should learn from whom and his actual practices in pedagogical and aesthetic realms in light of participatory and child-led approaches to the study of childhood and children's literature, as well as in relation to Mara Gubar's kinship theory model of agency, to which I will return later in this talk today. We might also consider Justina Trubicak and Macarena Garcia Gonzalez's view of entanglements and approaching the child relationally. As they write, thinking relationally about the child as always already entangled means in turn that childhood and adulthood can be seen as both a result of biological and social forces and as a set of social, material, and discursive practices. Childhood is done or enacted by both children and adults, and through entangled relations with materiality surround and exceed children and adults as entities. Tolstoy's example ultimately will show how entangled these relations might be and demonstrate the multiple forces coalescing around childhood, including pedagogical and aesthetic ones, for example, in examples I'll focus on today. Reading Who Should Learn to Write from Whom anachronistically, and I'm inspired to do this by the Slavicist Erich Neyman, we might consider how Tolstoy, too, reacts to these debates around the impossibility of literature for children and his recognition of children's co-creation of culture by abandoning the idea of teaching children to write and instead encouraging children in their own attempts to co-create literature and culture. He thus flips the hierarchy, reversing the position of children and adults. However, from within a Russian theoretical context, as Mikhail Bakhtin points out in his writings on Rabelais and Carnival, and as Carol Emerson notes in her studies of Bakhtin, the temporary reversal of a hierarchy still maintains that same hierarchy, which also returns after the temporary interruption to its regime has ceased. So we might ask if Tolstoy's flip in perspective continues to maintain that same hierarchy, or whether from the perspective of childhood studies, problematizing the opposition of child and adult, it offers a true perspectival flip in Mara Gubar's terms. Although Leo Tolstoy, as a writer for adults, is well known internationally, and as a writer for children is well known in Russia and translated internationally as well, and I'll show some examples, just a few in a moment, a few words about his biography seem useful here. So Leo, or Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, was born in 1828 on his family's estate, Yasnaya Polyana, near Moscow. However, his mother died when he was 2 and his father died when he was 9. So he was an orphan brought up by relatives, an experience which I think certainly colored his views on childhood. He owed his earliest literary success to the 1852 publication of Childhood, a pseudo-autobiographical novel, to use Andrew Wachtel's term. Born to an aristocratic family, to a count and a princess, Tolstoy ultimately rejected his inherited and earned wealth and famously chose to wear simple peasant clothing. In fact, a teacher who once came to teach at his school did not at first believe the person in a sheepskin coat and boots they encountered outdoors on Tolstoy's estate was actually Count Leo Tolstoy himself, though it, of course, proved to be so. Although Tolstoy served in the military in his younger days, the experience made him a pacifist, and he was a famous and influential proponent of nonviolence, who inspired his personal correspondent, Mahatma Gandhi, and later influenced Martin Luther King Jr. With his ideas. He ultimately lived to see the first decade of the 20th century, dying in 1910, meaning he was captured on film and audio as well before his death. By the time of his death, though excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church, he was a spiritual leader and well known around the world, where his influence, including in Tolstoyan communities, also outlasted his life. In this context today, though, Tolstoy's pedagogical enterprises, writings about childhood, and writings for children prove the most important, of course, but we might also contextualize this activity within his lifelong preoccupation with and devotion to childhood as a subject, to the end of his life, when he wrote The Wisdom of Children, where children speak the truth, quote, from the mouths of babes, unquote, as it were. Tolstoy was a product of his times, and in some ways behind the times in his adherence to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, or use of old religious models, and in some ways truly radical and ahead of his times in his views of children, for example. His model casts a long shadow within Russia in relevant realms for today's talk, and abroad as a spiritual leader, thinker, and writer. But his contributions to childhood studies, I think, are not sufficiently known or acknowledged in an international context. After immersing himself in teaching, Tolstoy turned his attention also to the writing of pedagogical materials and literature for children. His literature for children includes the long-standing and popular children's story about the young boy, Philippok, little Philip, who wishes to go to school like the other children, and lifts forward Tolstoy's child-centered and child-driven pedagogical principles. Tolstoy also collected wisdom contained in stories and tales from a variety of folk traditions, ranging from Aesop's and Hindu fables to tales from around the world, showing his belief that the world's wisdom can and should be shared with children. In later translations, Tolstoy's stories also reached children in other world regions, like the Italian Animali Protagonisti, illustrated by Attilio Casinelli, as you see here, or the English Nikolenka's Childhood, illustrated remarkably by Maurice Sendak, as you see here. As a teacher and co-author, then, Tolstoy takes an avid interest in children's perspective and literary impulses by co-authoring writing with children, vociferously advocating for its value at the expense of literature by adults, and publishing and promoting children's writing, as well as writing for children and for adults in ways inspired by his writings with and for children. In this way, he was not only an important precursor to the infantile primitivism of the avant-garde and modernist interest in childhood in Russia, as I mentioned before, which also took up his question, who should learn from whom, but proves to be an important pioneer in childhood studies in Russia and on a global stage in reevaluating childhood and challenging the traditional power relations, not only between child and adult, but also peasant child and aristocratic adult. His multifaceted and entangled activities as writer, pedagogue, teacher, publisher, and journalist, which had a tremendous influence within Russia, lift forward the voices of children who otherwise certainly would have remained unheard, engage children in participatory work, and position the child as a co-creator with the adult at a remarkably early date, 1862, so over 160 years ago. Many of Tolstoy's writings for children likewise account for the perspective of the child and offer a reevaluation of traditional assumptions. The child-centered tale about little Philip, who wishes to go to school, asserts how even very young children wish to and should be taken seriously and have a right to an education. His tales and versions of famous fairy tales sometimes offer a turnabout or perspectival flip, like his version of Little Red Riding Hood, where the wolf emerges victorious, and of Three Bears, which can be seen as a war and peace for small children, as Ben Hellman points out. Tolstoy also considers children a worthy audience for profound spiritual ideas, such as in his retellings for children of episodes from world literature for adults promoting spiritual principles. Examples include the story of the bishop and the robber from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, or concepts like loyalty, as in the tale of the lion and the puppy, as you see here, adapted from French, which relates how a little dog thrown into a lion's cage becomes his beloved companion, and whose later death causes the lion to lose his will to live. Tolstoy's stories espouse meekness and forgiveness and non-resistance to evil, a movement for which Tolstoy became a famous and influential figure, as shown in God Sees the Truth But Waits, for example. These stories level an even gaze at children as an audience capable of independently distilling and receiving profound moral lessons on an equal level with adults, even if the form is simpler. As Ben Hellman observes, no special children's themes were singled out, as Tolstoy favored content of universal interest. He thus levels the hierarchy between children and adults, just as he, a born aristocrat, sees the wisdom of folk traditions and idealizes the wisdom of simple peasants, like in War and Peace, and adopts folk practices like wearing traditional peasant clothing and even giving up his inherited wealth and earned wealth too. Indeed, one source of inspiration for his writings for children, as Ben Hellman notes, was the language of peasants and their children, as part of his reevaluation of who should learn from whom. For example, Tolstoy included 3 stories by peasant children in his collection, Vasya Morozov's The Soldier's Wife, as well as How I Was Caught in the Thunderstorm in the Wood and How I Stopped Being Afraid of Blind Beggars. Tolstoy also read texts out loud to the pupils at the school and to his own children. You see a similar setup here in the photo. In 1871, for example, his son Sergei was 9, daughter Tatiana 7, and Ilya, his son, 5. And he'd ask them to repeat everything in their own words, which he then would employ. This too represents a form of translation, adaptation, and co-creation with children, showing the complex entanglements of Tolstoy's many identities as teacher, writer, and here also parent. Using the same principles, Tolstoy later wrote several stories for the people based on the same poetics as his works for children, such as Where Love Is, There God Is Also, based on the 1882 Le Père Martin by Rubin Saillant, which spread across the world to Saillant's dismay and became Tolstoy's most famous children's book outside Russia. It might be noted that Tolstoy's literature for adults also often shows children as moral touchstones, such as in the role children play as mirrors of virtue and vice or goodness and evil in Anna Karenina. Indeed, what I would call cross-textual approaches to Tolstoy's writings for all audiences, or applying analysis across boundaries between literature for adults and for children, as I have advocated elsewhere, thus helps to illuminate consistent strains in his approach. So looking at in this bigger perspective is illuminating. Tolstoy's significance in pedagogical and aesthetic regards might also be considered in a broader and global historical context as well, where Leo Tolstoy's contributions to children's education, children's literature, and as a childhood studies pioneer also prove noteworthy. As a writer, thinker, educator, and spiritual leader, Tolstoy was many things to many people over the course of his long life. Importantly, however, as I have mentioned, the young Tolstoy first rose to literary prominence by writing his pseudo-autobiographical debut novel, Childhood, based on his own experiences and reminiscences from childhood. And his later career also evidenced a remarkable devotion to literature for children and children's education in theory and practice. After the highly successful debut of Childhood, however, Tolstoy became increasingly disillusioned with the literary life and by 1859 decided to abandon his life in society to devote his attentions to managing his property and educating peasant children. The first pedagogical interlude in Tolstoy's life included not only the establishment of a school at his estate, Yasnaya Polyana, and Tolstoy's personal engagement in teaching serf children, but also travels to study educational theory and practice, and the publication of the periodical Yasnaya Polyana in 1862 and 1863, which is where Who Should Learn from Whom first appeared. Today, even in English, there are many collections of Tolstoy's pedagogical writings and related texts, showing his significance in the field of education too. Tolstoy's engagement in pedagogy and pedagogical principles that support the autonomy and independence of children who were free, for example, to roam at will at his school, occur in the context of Tolstoy's demonstrated convictions about the rights and proper care of infants and their need for freedom and independent development, such as in being opposed to swaddling, or his faith in the value of children's own language, creativity, and natural development, inspired in some ways in these various regards by Rousseau, whose work also has a democratic and educationally innovative component, we might note. So Tolstoy belongs to a tradition outside of Russia as well, but had significant influence within related fields in Russia, including, it would seem, for example, Karne-Chukovsky's important work on children's language, rhymes, and poetry for children, known under the title From 2 to 5, which was first published in the 1920s, or an early version of this text, and also proves a pioneering work attending to children's own creative productions. So Tolstoy had a huge influence in this respect. In his discourses on children's writing, moreover, Tolstoy's assertion that adults have much to learn from the unschooled writing of children promotes the independent artistic capacity of children to produce culture. Tellingly, Tolstoy considers a child's identity as an artist to be primary and as a child secondary, as you see in this quotation here. And the artist, though a child, sees this very thing in the simplicity of his heart. Tolstoy recounts how he is at first awestruck and humbled at these peasant children's creative abilities. I could not make myself believe my experience. It seemed strange to me that a half-literate peasant boy should suddenly arrive at such conscious artistic powers, powers that Goethe, for all his immeasurable achievements, was unable to equal. It seemed strange and offensive to me that I, author of childhood, who had garnered some success and earned recognition for artistic talent from a cultivated Russian public, that I, in the matter of art, should be unable to teach anything to 11-year-old Semka or Fedka, or to help them in any way. This experience persuades Tolstoy that he has nothing to teach the children. Rather, in a dramatic recognition and reversal, he decides that he, and perhaps all adults, instead should learn from them, thus upending the hierarchy. The assumed hierarchy. He praises the child's natural gifts for language and artistic measure as stronger than in many authors I know, that sense of measure that only a few artists acquire after immense labor and study. His choice of words like primeval, uncorrupted, and pure primitive soul demonstrate how Tolstoy subscribes to the Romantic tradition and its regard for the child, as well as many other movements, as I've noted. Tolstoy also cites the important influence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau directly, even as he naturalizes and totalizes his beliefs by extending them to all eras and all men, as you see here. A healthy child is born into the world, completely satisfying all the demands of unconditional harmony of relations to truth, beauty, and goodness that we carry within us. The child is nearer to other beings, to plants, animals, and to nature, which always represents to us that truth, beauty, and goodness we are searching for. In all eras and with all men, the child has been represented as a model of innocence, sinlessness, goodness, truth, and beauty. Man is born perfect in the great words of Rousseau, words that remain firm and true as stone. And of course, we can take this with a grain of salt today. If Rousseau considered man to be perfect, then Tolstoy went so far as to consider children to be the ideal of perfection, as shown in an earlier draft of his childhood cycle, and quoted here. Inspired by the new views on childhood characteristic of Rousseau and Romanticism, Tolstoy reevaluates the place of children in unprecedented ways, going so far as to not only declare that adults should learn from children, but also that, more radically still, adults have nothing to teach children. If Rousseau rejected all books for Emile but Robinson Crusoe, then Tolstoy goes still further when he rejects everything but children's own work as a model for their writing. He commands, give the children children's work to read and give them only children's work as models, for children's compositions are always more correct, more artistic, and morally truer than adults' work. Of course, Tolstoy's own later activities, including writing pedagogical materials and stories for children, or his approach to educating his own children, when compared to that of peasant children on his estate, which was a lot more traditional, do counteract this claim, which is made here also for polemical effect. But nonetheless, the radical extent of his view, though still maintaining the basic hierarchical relation of child and adult, proves noteworthy at such an early date. Participating in discourses of his time and anticipating others, Tolstoy effectively describes the child as a primitive, pure and uncorrupted in its primeval state. The primitivist aspect of Tolstoy's interest in the child as artist, however, provokes critiques that may be leveled at the primitivist ethnographic impulse and raises anthropological anxieties. As Johannes Fabian describes in Time and the Other, the notion of the child as native as child, does a disservice both to the supposed native or primitive and the child. Yet Tolstoy also shows some evidence of anthropological self-awareness and self-criticism in this regard. For example, he considers that he may have corrupted the natural purity of the child through his intervention and fills with remorse at this thought. I dimly felt as if I were surreptitiously watching a beehive behind glass, in which the work of the bees was concealed from mortal eyes. It seemed to me that I had corrupted the pure primitive soul of a peasant boy. I dimly felt something like remorse for the act of sacrilege I had committed. In this way, Tolstoy, who emphasizes the alterity of the child, also scrutinizes his own actions critically and acknowledges the influence of the observer over the observed, and casts doubt once again on the adult influence on the child. He also displays an awareness of precisely the impossibility of children's literature that Jacqueline Rose later identifies, and even some of the same anxieties about this relationship, which one could continue in another vein. Nonetheless, though Tolstoy declares that a half-literate peasant boy writes better than Goethe or Tolstoy, and asserts that he feels unable to teach 11-year-old Semka or Fedka anything about writing literature, such declarations also weaken in the face of evidence of Tolstoy's interventions as he engages in co-creation with children. They also contradict children's protests against his intervention, which he, to his credit, nonetheless records. For example, his descriptions of the collaborative writing process reveal evidence of his influence. Telling details include the admission of changes based on fallible memory, such as, in the printed story Recalling the Lost Version, I combined the two versions from memory. Evidence of suggestions made by Tolstoy emerge in examples like, I would write it like this, I said. Tolstoy also made structural interventions and offered corrections in aspects he deemed of lesser significance. I came up with a title and divided the stories into chapters, here and there correcting mistakes made due to carelessness. Meanwhile, profuse apologies for Tolstoy's own unsuccessful contributions reveal his preconceived notions about the worth of the child's own talents, as you see here. The chapter is drastically weaker than all that follows. The fault is mine alone, for I could not hold back during the writing from making suggestions to Fedka and telling him how I might have written the chapter. If there is a certain triteness, I also am to blame for it. If I had left Fedka alone, I am sure he would have described the same actions subtly, more artistically, without using the accented and truly impossible methods. Here, Tolstoy even uses the same language of impossibility as he betrays his own notions and preconceptions, how they shape what he perceives, even if it is not there, right? At one point, the child's own voice of protest against the suggestions and overbearing presence of Tolstoy even emerges within the account, and I'd really like to lift this forward here. When I gave Fedka the plot of the story, I talked with him most about the father's return. I liked that scene and told it to him in a trite and sentimental way. He too liked the scene and said, "Don't tell me anything. I know it all myself. I know it." He sat down to write and finished the story in one sitting. This example demonstrates particularly clearly the child's own voice and agency. I know it all myself, I know it. And young Fedka's attempts to assert these in the face of Tolstoy's interventions. Don't tell me anything. This quotation thus preserves the struggle, the adult intervention, an overbearing influence, and the child's resistance that constitute the co-creation of literature and childhood by adult and child together, within an intergenerational interaction and exchange, demonstrating their entanglement and blurring the boundaries between who actually did what. Despite the child's protest and Tolstoy's interventions, however, it is also clear that Tolstoy's teaching, engagement, and activities have empowered the child to write and feel his own competence and agency. In his article, which in fact was prompted by skepticism on the part of his readers about the writings by children he promotes, Tolstoy addresses his critics quite directly. Ventriloquizing his skeptics, he says, "They will tell us, you, the teacher, may have unconsciously helped in the composition of this and other stories, and to define what belongs to you and what is original would be exceedingly difficult. They will tell us, you yourself are a writer, and without knowing it, you have been leading the students up paths that essentially cannot be taught by teachers who are not authors themselves." Tolstoy thus demonstrates an awareness of this possible critique of his own influence, and thus engages ideas around the apparent impossibility of children's literature again, where the imbalance of power is so significant. He thus moves in the same direction akin to alternative concepts for growth that challenge the normative development of the child into the adult, like growing sideways, as theorized within children's literature studies by Catherine Bond Stockton and Anne Malewski. In a way, I might venture that Tolstoy, in his turn to the child as model, example, and teacher, even advocates for something I might call growing down. That is, rather than the child growing up, the adult, or grown up, as defined in the language of and conceptual framework of a child, grows not up, but down, and toward the child becoming a grown down, which thus more deeply challenges the hierarchy or binary posited by Tolstoy's initial oppositional formation and engages the more radical conceptual movement and dislocation proposed by his question, who should learn from whom? The answer then is that the grown-up should grow down and become a grown down, where the language, norms, and concepts of the child instead govern, as occurs in the concept of the grown down I here propose. Nonetheless, the authoritative Tolstoy ultimately grants himself the last word in the article, as he steps back into the role of pedagogue, demonstrating the complex entanglement of aesthetics and pedagogy for him, that both inspire and govern his co-creation with the child. For example, he justifies his interventions in the name of pedagogy and a type of instructive scaffolding. Yet these pedagogical efforts also, in his account and through evidence of his lifelong impact, ultimately do seem to empower the child to achieve voice and agency by mastering the art of writing, as Fietka's example also shows, as do later writings by his pupils too. In so doing, Tolstoy puts forth an educational philosophy and instructive methodology unprecedented in Russian pedagogy at that point, and perhaps worldwide as well. Interestingly, the method Tolstoy advocates has features in some way akin to a recent but now discredited and reviled trend in writing instruction, which represented a student-centered framework for teaching writing based on frequent and extensive writing by beginning writers on topics of their own choosing. This is Lucy Kalkin's method. Interestingly, this approach is not dissimilar from Tolstoy's assertions, although a recent return to phonics instruction countering this educational trend also counters this approach. But this return to phonics instruction also, in fact, resembles some of the methods in Tolstoy's Primer, which works through phonics and syllables initially and according to old educational practices as well. Although Tolstoy's influence in these works is clear and shared openly enough that it can even now be detected, although it conceivably could have been obscured by Tolstoy to more effectively make his point, he also positions himself as the scribe of the children. This radically reconfigures authoritarian education of his time and empowers children. It also must be noted that this maneuver not only challenges the hierarchy of adult and child, but also of peasant and aristocrat, even as the scourge of serfdom was finally being abolished in Russia. So in describing this process, Tolstoy writes, I did the following. A few aspects of the work I at first took upon myself, gradually turning them over to the student's care. At first, I chose the ideas and images I considered best. I kept these in mind and pointed them out when appropriate. I consulted what had already been written, kept the students from repeating themselves, and played the role of a scribe, leaving the students free to clothe the images and ideas in words. I had them make their own choices, then consult the written texts themselves, until finally, as in the case of the life of a soldier's wife, they had taken the entire process of writing into their own hands. Tolstoy excuses his pedagogical interventions and a kind of instructional scaffolding on the basis of his educational goals and ultimate aim, which he claims to have achieved. They had taken the entire process of writing into their own hands. So though this in some sense contradicts what he says earlier, we can note how as a teacher and pioneer in childhood studies and participatory writing and co-creation methods, Tolstoy seeks to empower children to write for themselves as well and also without him. However his efforts might fall short, especially from a modern perspective, Tolstoy also did accomplish something unprecedented in granting voice to these children. He published these children's stories and acknowledged their independent value at a remarkably early date, 1862, which is unprecedented in Russia and possibly worldwide. Moreover, one might also note that even the parents of these children had been completely disenfranchised by the institution of serfdom until 1861. These children thus were severely disadvantaged socioeconomically and came from multi-generational legacies of deprivation. In all of these many senses, then, Tolstoy's acts could be seen as truly radical for their time, both in Russia and worldwide, and should perhaps be reconsidered from a contemporary perspective, which is an issue I'd like to raise today. In 1870, after publishing War and Peace in 1867, Tolstoy again turned his back on literature for a second period of pedagogical preoccupation. Over the next 5 years, he wrote and compiled materials for a complete course of elementary education, which he tested in his school and then revised. The first version was published in 1873 as primer, leaving Tolstoy satisfied enough to write, astonishingly, having written this primer, I can die in peace. His readers were less pleased. But this quote really shows the importance of this venture to him, which is quite remarkable if you think about his influence as a world writer and his overall creative output. The final, thoughtfully revised versions were published in 1875 as New Primer and Russian Readers. These materials met with general acceptance and were widely used in Russian schools for many years to come, until 1917, while the New Primer was published 28 times in around 2 million copies, meaning that several generations of Russian children were raised on Tolstoy's stories for children. These books, like his stated and practiced pedagogical beliefs, offer many child-centered or child-directed stories, fables, folktales, and situations, sometimes where adults learn from a small child. Tolstoy's writings for children thus also reflect his ideas on reversing the hierarchical relations between adult and child, and the author's radical reevaluation of childhood and children's culture, alongside his acknowledgement of children's role as co-creators of childhood. While the very fact of his practice as a children's writer demonstrates the high regard in which he held children's literature and children as an audience worthy of his efforts. The same who from whom reversal theme also finds reflection in his works by children and co-authored works Tolstoy publishes. For example, in the story written by his pupils, They Feed with the Spoon, Then Poke the Eye with the Handle, adults learn from children, while wisdom derives from folk culture. Similarly, in the fable, as it's termed, Old Grandpa and the Grandson, when the boy mimics his parents' behavior toward his grandfather in his behavior toward his parents, he shows his parents the true error of their ways. Indeed, in the works of Tolstoy, the young often teach their elders, or as in the Russian model of a holy fool, also associated with childhood, including in Tolstoy's own childhood, the book that is. Children often offer moral mirrors in his works throughout his career, whether or not the significance is properly apprehended by adults in the text, but of course the audience may be a different story. Tolstoy's work across the board thus represents a major shift in the 19th century attitude towards children and demonstrates Tolstoy's overarching, engaged, and entangled approach to childhood in a variety of areas, and the radical revision of past practices that situate him as a pioneer of childhood studies, as I'm arguing today. Contemporaneous with the progressive fight to liberate Russian serfs bound to the land and virtually without any rights, which finally occurred in 1861, the year after Tolstoy's article was published, Tolstoy had already discovered their still more disenfranchised children and sought to give them voice, successfully cultivated their agency, and prominently asserted the value of what they had to say, or to teach even. In so doing, I would argue that Tolstoy proved thus an important pioneer in childhood studies and children's literature research by engaging in intergenerational cooperation and authorship, participatory co-creation with children, while also enabling even underprivileged children's own voices and agency to be heard, heeded, recorded, and preserved for posterity through his publications. Indeed, in his 1862 article on the stories with or by children he published, Tolstoy offers remarkably early evidence of what we now know to be true. Children's literature need not be impossible, and children's culture is co-created with children who have always been there, even in 1862, who in Tolstoy's work speak out alongside the writer, co-authoring and co-constituting childhood, children's literature, and the culture in which they are always embedded and entangled, no matter whether their voices have been heeded, preserved, or recorded. Yet thanks to Tolstoy, these doubly disenfranchised peasant children did have their voices heard, their struggle for agency recorded, and their writing preserved, cultivated, and preserved forever, with long-lasting impacts on their lives. Returning now to Mara Gubar's kinship model theory of agency, as promised, we might consider her definition in relation to Tolstoy's early intervention in childhood studies, children's literature, and collaborative work with children. She writes, a kinship model theory of agency might therefore sound something like this. Children, like adults, have agency, even if aspects of the aging process are likely to limit the form or degree of agency that they have. In other words, having the kinship model enables childhood studies scholars to justify an impulse that is integral to the foundation of our field in its modern form. Namely, the belief shared by anthropologists, cultural historians, sociolinguists, and literary critics that scholars ought to attribute agency to children as social actors. Pache Duane, childhood studies did not emerge solely because researchers wanted to dismantle bad accounts of childhood, but also because they wanted to build better ones, often by treating children themselves not as passive objects, but rather as valued informants whose voices too often had been muted. What the history of our field suggests, I think, is that adults who maintain that children have agency are more likely than ones who do not to pay close attention to the words and deeds of young people, to seek out material traces of children's agency that might otherwise go uncollected, unanalyzed, or missing. Considering contemporary childhood studies perspectives, then, we might note how Tolstoy did not treat children as passive objects, even in an educational setting, but as valued informants whose voices had too often been muted, which he sought to remedy. He sought out and cultivated, quote, traces of children's agency that otherwise would have gone uncollected, unanalyzed, missing, unquote, preserved them, promoted them, and shared them with audiences at a remarkably early date and in ways that we now can access today. In addition, he forcefully asserted their value to broad audiences by posing the question, who should learn from whom? And isn't that, in fact, a central question of childhood studies and contemporary approaches across disciplines to anthropological research and working across difference and with disenfranchised groups and valued informants? In any case, in response to his own question of who should learn from whom, it is clear that Tolstoy at least recognized, learned from, co-created with, and promoted the voices, agency, and independent creative talent of children, and disenfranchised children at that, at a remarkably early time in Russia, and I would venture worldwide. In this way, Leo Tolstoy himself made a significant intervention in the history of childhood and children's literature research, and distinguishes himself not only as a teacher of children, a writer of childhood, and a writer for children, but also as a childhood studies pioneer, who deserves a prominent place in the history of our field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you for this insightful, beautifully structured, and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure that there will be tons of questions. So if you do have a question, just raise your digital hand. If you do not want to raise your digital hands, you can also use the chat function. You can just write down your question in the chat. So we have two options.
I like the expression digital hand.
Yes, nice. I love it too. Yeah. Because it's, I mean, technically, if you want to, you can also raise your regular hand if your video is on. So that's also an option, you know, but tiny little digital hands can also be raised. Yeah, so. Questions. Everyone is thinking probably and trying to process everything. Because I think that you have to introduce many new things about an author. most of us are familiar with, because thinking about Tolstoy, most people think of his major work, which is not children's literature, and his works for children, and are sometimes forgotten, I think. And that's something that you've beautifully shown us. What you have beautifully shown us is that his contribution to the field of children's literature, but also the field of childhood studies, is unprecedented, considering the time period and the circumstances. I personally really like the mentions of Rousseau, because I kept on, even after reading your abstract, I kept on thinking about Rousseau. Okay, but there is a question, so that's enough of me. So Alex, Lilia Dashevsky. Lilia, can you please go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, sorry, can you hear me? I'm new to
Yes.
Teams, so thank you so much, Sarah, for this amazing talk. In the past, I've worked with this article written by Tolstoy, and so it was so enriching to have a different perspective on it, and to sort of contextualize it within childhood studies. Thank you so much for it. I have tons of ideas and sort of desires to follow up on. But could you speak a little bit about Tolstoy and sort of the Russian progressive debates about education, specifically Ushinsky, and sort of the other debates that were happening at the time? Because you were discussing how Tolstoy studied abroad, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about sort of the other educational debates that were happening in Russia at the time, whether this idea of the reverse hierarchy was unique to Tolstoy, or whether it was featured in others, in other works. And I'm specifically working with Nekrasov's poem written at the same time, 1861, Nekrasov's Peasant Children. And of course, Nekrasov is doing something very different. He is maintaining the hierarchy between the writer and the children, but at the same time, he is sort of arguing a similar thing, that peasant children are infinitely more moral and more sort of smart and more everything than not only non-peasant children, but also adults. So it seemed that these ideas were circulating at the time, and I was wondering if you could speak more to that. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lilia, and really interesting points. And yeah, I think what you raised too illustrates this, this entanglement of ideas, and the complexity also of it. Thinking about Tolstoy in his own context, and then in this broader context, and then the very many different fields that he's dabbling in, or really standing out in some cases. So I've been looking at it kind of more, not so much from the educational perspective, but more kind of from the aesthetic one. So the pedagogical aspect is important, but I'm kind of looking from the childhood studies, literature, co-creation kind of perspective more. But of course, from the other direction, they interface here in interesting ways. So yeah, I think that that's a really valid way to think about it, and I'd love to, in fact, to look into that more in terms of his educational innovations. And certainly he was really influenced by his travels abroad too, and education. And just I'm continually astonished by the range, this kind of global range of what he was reading and what he was drawing on. So really, you can't talk about Tolstoy in just one context, because he really was, engaging ideas from so many different regions, and even different periods, and then his influence was as well. So he really kind of stands at this nexus and this kind of complex entanglement of ideas, and I do think that what he is doing, to kind of address your point, I do think what he is doing is reflective in many ways of what was happening in various fields, and also of what was going to happen, and that they were part of this. For example, the return to the folk that I mentioned, that whole trend he's part of that as well. So yeah, thank you I'd love to speak more about it, and I look forward to your work on Nekrasov too. Hope to see it soon, and nice to see you.
Okay, we have one comment and question in our chat. Love this, thank you. I would love to read the essay you quoted. I think who should learn to write from whom, and I can't seem to find it. Where might I be able to find the essay?
Yeah, and it might depend on which language you'd like to seek it in. Certainly in the original Russian and the collected works, you'd be able to find it. In English, actually, it is included in, there are multiple compilations. They're right here, for example, in English of his pedagogical writings. So multiple publications essentially called something like Tolstoy on Education or Tolstoy as Teacher that include a variety of his pedagogical materials. So you would certainly find it within there. And oh, wow, yeah. I'm noticing also your second aspect there. For autistic children as well as for teachers and parents, the process of learning is ongoing for all involved. That is a fascinating point. And in some other work that I've been doing on early writers, in this case, a Swedish writer, Martha Sandvall Bergström, who had a daughter with disabilities. I also think it's actually quite extraordinary sometimes to look back and to recognize when writers and thinkers are, in fact, maybe ahead of their time in terms of thinking also about an accommodating disability. That reminds me also of Maria Montessori and developing an educational model about that accommodates children, with in difficult circumstances, and how that kind of those kinds of methods might work well for all children. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Oh, and we have more questions. First, Molly, and then we have a question from Anastasia Lanovich, and there's one in the chat. So Molly, please go ahead. You're first.
Oh, thanks. Hi. A wonderful
Hello.
talk.
So good to see you.
I was just curious because you mentioned that Tolstoy did a lot with the peasant children, and I was just wondering if you feel that's a kind of reaction against his more privileged upbringing, and that there's sort of a drive for creatives to kind of embrace a childhood that's kind of diametrically opposite from the one they've known. And so whether it kind of, if he had come from a less privileged upbringing, whether he would have been drawn to work with children from a more affluent sort of area, whether it kind of there's a drive for embracing kind of the alternative reality from the one you know.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to think about. And I think his idealization of peasant children, it can also be related to his idealization of like the peasant adult in his writings for adults. And you were also asking about his own childhood experience, and of course he came from privilege. But then on the other hand, I think losing both his parents would be a challenge as well. And so this makes me think of Chekhov's statement about in my childhood there was no childhood. So is it possible that maybe his interest in childhood also had to do with his own deprivation of a childhood with his parents, for example? One could ask oneself, and they may be going in kind of like psychoanalytical directions here too, but there is a kind of like wish fulfillment too of, he didn't really know his mother ever. So the role of the mother, the idealization, I would say, may come out of like even his own deprivation in certain respects with respect to childhood, despite his very privileged material circumstances. But yeah, that is interesting, this also kind of interest in the experience of others, maybe, and of the peasant experience. Certainly he's idealizing that. And maybe this maneuver for Tolstoy too, your question is really interesting and making me think. But maybe this maneuver too of like who should learn from whom, that Tolstoy was in a way kind of eager to look at things from a different perspective and to challenge and question and even give up what he had and what he knew in order to take a different perspective on it. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And we have another question from Anastasia Ulanovich.
Hello, Sara. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for coming.
I very much enjoyed your talk, and I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about any relationships you perceive between Tolstoy's interest in childhood creativity, and especially the creativity of peasant children, and his work in aesthetics. I think especially, for example, his essay on what is art. Are there any kind of perhaps connections there?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and he's such a complicated individual, really, in so many respects, and lived such a long life and dabbled in so many fields, and represented one thing and then forsook it later on, and undergoes this very long development in his life too. So yeah, that's a good question. This willingness to abandon things, I think, is interesting, and to abandon assumptions and principles. Interesting to think about, and of questioning assumptions and maybe turning in a different direction. Like being excommunicated, is kind of like indicative, like willing to just abandon a tradition and like, I have a better idea. And this is what I like, and this is what I will do. So there's a kind of boldness to that, but also, I see in Tolstoy this kind of like eternal searching, that he's never really satisfied, never really finds the answer. We see that reflected also in some of his protagonists, who often have resemblances to himself, and this like ever searching and finding something and thinking like, oh, here, I've got it, and then like abandoning it and feeling despair and so on. So I guess that's how I would see him as on a journey, continually on a journey, never necessarily finding the answer, but the journey itself is interesting.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. We have also some questions in the chat. I think that you can see the chat, Sara, because most often our guests can't see it, but I can guess that you see the questions. But here is a question about Tolstoy's primer, if it still has influence on the current Russian primary education.
That's a good question. I don't have a ton of knowledge on that, but I don't, as an educational resource or textbook, I don't believe that it is used in that way any longer. And it would probably be outdated and in many respects. From various perspectives, and in Russia we have this continual abandonment of textbook as the whole like version and telling of history, for example, changes. But I do think that Tolstoy's writings for children still have influence and would still figure in. I haven't looked into it, but I would presume that Tolstoy still figures in small ways, that stories of his would be figuring in primary education, and that his primer or his his writings for children with this like that arose out of this pedagogical aim would still be reaching children in other ways too. Like some of the book covers I showed were more contemporary works, republishing his work. So. And especially they were small and adapted for children, so they could easily, be dispersed or shared in other ways, even if not strictly through the primer itself.
Okay, and here's another question from Svetlana Efimova. Thank you so much, dear Sara. I'm wondering whether there were co-creative projects directly inspired by Tolstoy's experiments.
That's a good question. I have one answer to that, but I'd be interested if there are if there's a lot more. I suppose I referred I think it's an interesting question, and I think one would have to do a lot of extensive research to see if there's more than what I'm thinking of. But what I am thinking of, I mentioned, Kornei Chukovsky's collection of children's language and in terms of poetic experiments. And it seems to me that would be inspired by this question. Tolstoy was so influential. So when he asked, who should learn from whom, I think that really echoed in Russia in so many ways. And so I see so many influences. And I would say, as I kind of very briefly pointed to, that and talk about in my first book, Voiceless Vanguard, the infantilist aesthetic of the Russian avant-garde, which was recently republished in Russian, I would say that, in my view, like avant-garde experiments that were going back to the child, for including Russian futurist poets, collecting children's writings and publishing those and imitating those in their own work, or artists collecting children's art and being inspired by that in their neo-primitivist art, as well as this kind of that on the one hand, this is kind of a direct influence in response to Tolstoy's question, who should learn from whom, and this turn toward children's artistic production, inspiring. So in a sense, that might be kind of co-creative, and sometimes it was literally co-creative, other times just inspired by. But I also think, we might also speculate kind of more broadly, and this isn't exactly, co-creation as you're asking about in your question, but that Tolstoy's influence and turn to the child, what influence that might have had on the 20th century, focus on childhood. Because Tolstoy was so influential, perhaps his traces are, maybe evident even in, early 20th century experiments. The World of Art, too, was publishing children's art and writings, and but also in the Soviet period, maybe this kind of view of childhood as important and central and who should learn from whom and so on, may also have been inspired by Tolstoy. So I think this is one reason why it's interesting to go back and recover the prehistory here too. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I appreciate it very much, Svetlana. And I think it would be interesting to see if there's something like more akin to exactly to what he has done, but I don't know about it besides the examples that I'm mentioning now, which is actually a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm looking at the chat, but I can't see
No questions.
Any other questions. But maybe someone wants to ask or comment or just say something nice. Mateusz has some technical problems. Is it okay, Mateusz? Are you
Yeah,
there?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
You're
Can you see me
frozen.
now?
You're frozen.
I'm still frozen. Okay, I don't know why.
I can see you. You're moving for me. And maybe
okay,
I'll take
good.
this moment. Oh, there, yeah. I might take this moment to repeat, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I highly encourage everyone to join the International Research Society for Children's Literature that has a conference in Salamanca, Spain this summer. And I know several of you will be there and look forward to seeing you there. But I encourage scholars to join this organization. It's so valuable for myself, and I think for everyone to get to connect internationally. And I really appreciate this opportunity to see you and to speak with scholars on the other side of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, here we have some thank you. Yes, thank you for a great talk.
Yeah.